Welcome to the Modern Artrepreneur, a podcast documenting my circuitous approach to blending art and entrepreneurship. This is episode 6, where I'm discussing the Mystery Tin podcast network. If you haven't listened to episode 3 yet, about launching Mad Potential with Ben and Mel, I'd recommend going back and listening to that before you get too far into this episode. There's a link in the show notes. Coming off the success of Mad Potential's first season, I felt that we really had podcasting down to a science. We knew when things were due, I knew about how long it would take me to edit a file and get it up onto the website, and I figured out a system to getting Ben to give me the work when I needed it in order to put the product out. We also implemented some social media sharing strategies, which ended up really boosting our numbers when we brought in guests. Up to this point, we have about 4,000 downloads. Each episode has a couple hundred downloads, and we're looking for sponsors. So if you are listening to this show and thinking about potentially sponsoring a podcast, Mad Potential with Ben Mel is definitely a good place for you to start and hitting a prime market of people who are motivated to better themselves and better the world around them. We needed to continue the momentum going. We were ending our 2-month run, and Ben needed to take 2 months off so that we could reassess what we were doing. We could work on our strategies for doing interviews and the like. So we've really been having a downturn in terms of his show's presence on the network. But we needed to continue to expand. So just like running a record label, I'm running this podcast network as a way of working with my friends and people whom I believe are extremely talented. So I shook my friend tree, and a couple of my brilliant friends popped out. So I pursued a college buddy about starting his own self-help podcast because he has started a community with thousands of followers and people embracing his self-help approach on 5 different continents, maybe 4 different continents. But his presence and his message was worthy of a podcast. We went back and forth about trying to get it ready and about how he would record on Tuesdays and I would launch on Fridays, and we would promote this positive momentum going into the weekend. But his schedule tightened up and there wasn't enough room to launch a podcast. So unfortunately, that one fell through. I called on a DJ friend of mine from back east who happens to run a large music promotion program, running parties and arranging concerts and festivals. And I wanted him to put together, or at least headline, a music mix podcast. Once a month, a 2-hour deep house mix that would come out on the Mystery Tin podcast network. And through his connections, he could help me negotiate some of the finer tuned intricacies of copyright and streaming with regards to music. But again, the formatting and the process of starting a podcast on his end was not yet in the works. So we unfortunately had to put that one on pause until a later date. So then I started to go towards some of the more extreme or perhaps niche people and topics that I am familiar with. And one of my favorite things to discuss are conspiracy theories. And I had a friend who is deeply, deeply rooted into conspiracy theories and loves finding these hidden or unappreciated web of connections between real world events. But he just didn't find it in his life to be able to commit a couple hours a week to the research and writing and counterpoints and all of the things that would really be required to run a successful conspiracy podcast. He just didn't have it in him. Not to mention, he just started a family and moved to Hawaii, so his bandwidth was stretched pretty thin. So then I turned to other friends, a pair of brothers in San Francisco who are working in real estate. They were considering doing a real estate podcast about the Bay Area, which is an immensely blossoming, immensely interesting topic, considering the ebb and flow of the hippie and tech cultures that find themselves in the Bay Area. That would be an interesting approach and an interesting opinion on real estate. But as real estate happens, it gets very busy very quickly, and yet again, this one fell through. So last but not least, I called on my good old buddy Ward Sorick about potentially doing another podcast about his efforts in Los Angeles, from moving there to following his acting career and his production work and his directing work. All of those things were intriguing enough to me with regards to his persona that people would be interested in hearing what it really takes in order for somebody who is motivated to succeed in Hollywood, what it really takes, and how to deal with those lumps of not getting cast or not getting paid, or all of the things that we as dreamers and as those of us who are on the outside of the entertainment industry never get to see. We always see the shiny end product, but we never really get involved with the speed bumps and the hurdles and the legwork that it takes to make it in Hollywood. But as life goes, this one too fell apart because Ward's plate started to fill with many other projects that could potentially be more financially beneficial than this podcast. So quite naturally, that's where his attention gravitated toward, and I was left without a podcast. I've had 6 different podcasts, people who are interested, fall away, despite my overwhelming urge and desire to do all of the back end work for them. All they would have to do is help me create the content, and I would take care of the rest. Despite all of that, we couldn't find a way to make any of these podcasts work. So I had one last chance. I had to do my own podcast. This podcast, The Modern Artrepreneur, started out being called The Drawing Board, which was going to be a discussion of one particular project from start to finish, from the drawing board through the completed project, whatever it happened to be. But as I explored that idea and that concept, it was not as applicable to many others as some of my bigger projects, and particularly to be informative about how to balance creative endeavors while still maintaining a social life and another form of occupation if need be. So I decided to change the name to The Modern Artrepreneur, which is a portmanteau using entrepreneur, because I'm really attempting to make money, self-sufficient, surviving money, on my creative endeavors. And I figured that my level of expertise across a number of these topics and these creative endeavors that I'm embarking on is perhaps equal to or slightly more experienced, motivated, informed than perhaps some of my listeners. But a majority of my errors and my decision-making processes are absolutely in line with the people that listen and the people that are intrigued and the people that are potentially going to start their own creative project, but are too afraid of the speed bumps along the way to really get started. It's that fear of perfection and doing it right the first time and running it perfectly that can keep a lot of people from jumping into something. So we jumped right in with Mad Potential with Ben Mel. I figured I might as well jump in and do the same deep end learning to swim with the Modern Artrepreneur. This podcast would be less about interviews and more about deconstructing my process and discussing my thoughts behind the choices that I've made along the way with regards to the podcast network, the card game, or my ebook. So the goal of the Modern Artrepreneur was more to share than to draw information out of somebody else. So the format would be a little bit more structured, and unfortunately, or perhaps as a gift, it would require more editing, more design, more execution than simply setting up the microphone and hitting record. And as soon as I started, holy shit, this is hard. I found myself struggling from the very beginning to record my podcast. I sounded rigid. I sounded like I was reading, and it's probably because I was reading. I was terrified while watching the audio waveform of my recorded voice span the spectrum. I was scared that the way I was sounding, my intonations were withdrawn, and the topics that I was so motivated about and passionate about in my projects that I'm so committed to, I sound unenthusiastic and flat. And the truth be told is, if you go back and listen to those first episodes, I sound terrified. I sound like I am giving the worst reading of terrible writing over a recorded microphone ever. And despite that feeling then and that feeling now, I had to push out the podcast. We had to get it out because we wanted to hopefully collect some of those listeners from Ben's podcast, draw in new artistic community of listeners, as well as draw the attention of people interested in starting their own businesses, no matter how amazing or crazy the idea. But in my delivery of these messages and the delivery of my content, I sounded like I was terrified to be there and unconfident with my ability and my skills in regards to my projects. But I can assure you now, I'm getting more confident with each podcast. I am making more progress on each project than I've ever done before. And I'm really passionate about the things that I'm speaking to and about the projects that I'm sharing with you. So when we launched the podcast in the beginning of October, there was a slow reception. Admittedly, numbers of downloads were very low and click numbers were very low. It appeared that we didn't get the crossover we were hoping for. We couldn't draw in that audience because for some reason our message between Mad Potential and the Modern Artrepreneur, this empowering of listeners to take a chance and to do the things that make them happy because they help other people, that message did not translate with our listenership. We were looking at hundreds, over 300 subscribers to Mad Potential. And as of the current date, the Modern Artrepreneur hasn't broken 30. Where are we missing the mark? I have two computers. One is more for writing and the general day-to-day computer usage, and the other is a wholly committed art computer that's jam-packed with Adobe Suite, Final Cut Suite, Final Draft, Reason, Sonar. I have an assortment of programs, high-level programs that can help you make anything from music videos to feature films to billboards, and it's all kept on one aging computer. In order to be successful in podcasting and perhaps almost anything in life, you need to work into people's routines. A great example of this is the Script Notes podcast comes out every Tuesday morning, and I know without a doubt that the podcast is going to go up between 8 and 8:30 a.m. My Tuesday morning includes Script Notes. When Ben and I launched, we wanted Mondays to be Mad Potential Mondays so that he would give people a motivated start to their week. Then, as we shifted to add the short forms, the less than 5-minute inspirational pieces, we decided to launch those on Thursday mornings so that people would be inspired to finish out their week strong and then chase after that enjoyment of life on the weekends. When the Modern Artrepreneur was launched, we decided that we would post on Wednesdays. So the first 2 Wednesdays, we were on point without a problem. A few late nights, a few early editing sessions, a few post-production quick changes, but ultimately the podcast did come out on Wednesday mornings. Until the computer that houses all of my art, including my podcast network, crashed. And I mean completely crashed, battery dead, will not turn on, not a green light, not an orange light, lights out. I called around to the Apple stores. They don't carry the battery for my vintage 2008 MacBook Pro. So I had to order a new battery, hoping that that would solve the problem. However, I ordered with PayPal one-click, and as I'd recently relocated to Portland, it one-click sent to my previous address in Southern California. So not only was I out my computer for a full week, so I'd already missed an episode of The Modern Artrepreneur, and people were asking where it was. I also had to wait an additional 3 days for my battery to be reshipped from Southern California back up here to Portland. By the time I was able to get my computer and do the work and post another podcast, I was 10 days behind. And at that point, we very well could have lost listeners because I had failed to deliver on the consistency they needed in order to continue their subscribership. So I hustled and stayed up late and did my best to put out the 2 podcasts that week that I had missed. So I put out one on Monday, and I put one out on Wednesday night, hoping to redraw my subscribers back in, boost the downloads number, build the momentum and the ratings and the reviews in iTunes. Despite all that, still not a major jump in any of my numbers. Subscribers went up, but not on a grand scheme. Downloads were not anything more than average. I simply was playing catch up in order to get back to the place that I was before our major technical network error. And I gotta admit, it was tough. With a little over 2 weeks until the launch of Mad Potential Season 2, we've got a lot of restructuring to do at the podcast, not only in terms of our technical abilities, but also our business motivations. Acquiring a sponsor, even for short forms, is a top priority in order to get the podcast truly at a place where it can be sustainable, not only on a financial level, but also in terms of keeping a solid demographic of listeners. This means that we have to continue to engage them not only in the podcast space, but also outside of the podcast space. So during a majority of these 2 months that we've had between seasons 1 and 2, Ben has been working around the clock to update, build out, and give a real presence to his Mad Potential brand. On my end, I have to do the same thing with the Modern Artrepreneur. I have to continue to churn through my projects as they come, while still getting ready to go back into production on Ben's podcast. The next step in my book is to get another audio engineer to help take over the editing of these podcasts. Because if we can eliminate that from my plate, I can spend more time producing, promoting, marketing, and really getting into the nitty-gritty of running the podcast network versus spending my late nights editing together audio from 4 different phone calls across 3 different states. Instead, I can just focus on delivering the content in the best way possible to the right people with the right help. That is running a podcast network. And it's harder than it sounds.